Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is Chander in Palo Alto, still in shelter in place, and I'm very glad that Arne is back with us.
Yeah, hello. This is Arne here from Oslo, also in sort of lockdown scenario in Oslo.
Yeah. So how are things going, Arne? It's been like almost a month. We are in lockdown or shelter in place.
Yeah, so situation seems to be improving in the sense that the number of infected are going down in Norway, and schools are about to start again in a week, a little bit more than a week. So there's going to be easing, and that's going to be interesting to see whether that will lead to flare-ups and new lockdowns, or whether it's going to be on some path to normalization over time.
Wow. So kids are actually going to go to school in a week?
So the preschoolers are going in on Monday in 4 days, and then the young school kids are coming a week later, if everything goes according to plan.
Wow. Actually, this will be interesting. I think everybody's concerned about coronavirus. So can you share your observations on how the Nordics are dealing with it differently than the US?
Well, there are also differences within the Nordics. I'm obviously mostly familiar with Norway and somewhat with Denmark, but all of them. It seems to me that Norway, Denmark, and to some extent Finland is dealing with it somewhat similarly, with pretty clear lockdowns, and a lot of things essentially stopped. So schools and preschools and a number of businesses are essentially closed down by law, whereas Sweden has opted for a more open approach, where it's more recommended that people do this and do that. So clearly less restrictions, and therefore also a higher level of activity coming through this. And essentially that means that there are more infected people, although that's not as clear in Sweden because testing is less broad, but clearly much more deaths as well in Sweden. So I guess one of the more interesting questions is, of course, whether that means Sweden will be through quicker as well. And it's more that the aggregated numbers are over a smaller period of time. I guess that's the key question here.
Mm-hmm. But the people I speak with, my friends in Lund and Malmo, they are observing lockdown. Like they say they're at home, not going out. So even if it's voluntary, the people I know, they are voluntarily not going out.
It's not that you do it. Still, a lot of people do, but of course, the effect in the short term is much bigger if it's observed by everyone. And I think that's the effect you've seen early on in the other countries here in the Nordics.
And how do you see we in the US are dealing with it differently?
Well, President Trump has sort of been saying how badly things are in Sweden to find somebody to pick on. And in fact, I think possibly the US has the worst approach of any country anywhere in the world. And the reason for saying that is that the US, it seems like, was hit pretty late, so should have had the best opportunity to learn from everyone. Secondarily, once it hit, the reaction was denial and late reaction, with a few exceptions of some states. Mm-hmm. So no action. And then once there is a reaction, it's also bad in that it's just badly organized. And secondarily, it's different from place to place, so that you have no common approach and no common result. And therefore, you will have this spin around where there's no control overall. So the only way to seem to go through it is to have it sort of blow out by itself and in a disorderly fashion. So I'm surprised how badly it could be managed.
Yeah, I mean, I hope it's over soon.
And just to remark, that doesn't mean that all states have handled it necessarily badly. It just means that they won't reap the benefits of a good management of it, because they will have, effects from other states handling it, and the federal level handling it badly, right? So there's some interconnectivity of effects here.
Yeah, yeah, and that is actually a good segue into our topic of the day, that is systems thinking, where you study, if I have to describe it in one sentence, it's the study of interconnectivity of things, which Arne was just saying how, and if you think about it, if we had thought that way, looked at the interconnectivity of all things, when it came out of China, the whole world should have gotten on alert and taken measures to stop it at that time. So we thought systems thinking would be a good topic to discuss in context of where things are and how startups can benefit from that type of thinking.
Yeah, cool. And this is a topic that you are have both been thinking a lot about, Chander, and also that you've been sort of thinking about for a while, and are a topic that you like. So can you say a little bit about why you got interested in the first place?
Yeah, that's actually a good story, and it's related to our last podcast on education. So I studied undergrad in India and specialized in electrical engineering, and then I came to the US to study business. So I have an MBA from University of Miami, and I went there because they gave me a scholarship. So it was pretty easy decision. And at that time, I didn't really know much about university system in the US, and also about the US, because there was no internet in India when in late 90s when I came. So then, you start working, you start hearing these names about, um, Harvard and MIT and Stanford, etc. So I was curious, how, like, what are they teaching that's so special? Why are these places so famous? So I went there to attend executive programs to see what is so special there. And, there is nothing special. It's like you attend, an executive program over weeks, and all the summary of all that is, oh yeah, listen to your customer. So I was kind of disappointed in the quality of the content. And once you've been doing business, it's there isn't much new. You're in it. And then by chance, I attended this program at MIT on system dynamics, which I loved. So it's basically study of systems instead of studying parts of the system. So let me explain what it means. So in the most of the world we have today is built on linear thinking or analytical thinking, meaning if we want to understand something, we take it apart, we understand each part, and then we aggregate the thinking together, so to see what that thing is. So for example, if we want to uh, understand a car, we take it apart, we say this is the motor, this is the engine, these are the tire, this is the steering wheel. And if you understand each part and role of the part, then you understand the car. Similarly, I have an MBA, so the classes I attended were marketing, finance, logistics, strategy. So if I understand parts of business, that means I understand business. So as an MBA, there is no class titled business, So that's how most of the world is structured. Any big company you see, there's marketing, finance, etc., and academia. the government. Things are structured that way, and that happened in the Renaissance era in 1400s. That's where this idea of linear thinking or analysis came about, how to understand things, and it's been continuing since then. And the field of system thinking is based on synthesis, which is the opposite of analysis. So to understand something, let's keep the example of car, you understand what is it part of. So a car is part of the transportation system. So then what you do is you study the transportation system and see what role does a car play in the transportation system. And then step 3 is you disaggregate that learning to understand, why that car exists. So the linear thinking answers, or an analytical thinking answers the question of how things work, and the synthesis or systems thinking answers the question why things are the way they are. So this is basic difference. And then if you may hear this term complexity science, complex systems, complex adaptive systems. There are a few other things, but the idea of all of them is to understand the study of the parts, to see how parts give rise to behavior of the system. So coming back to the education side at MIT, from there I went to study. There's a think tank called New England Complex Systems Institute. So I studied with them, got into more detail and modeling. I wrote, I think 1 or 2 research papers with the professor, and he's absolute genius person. His name is Yanir Baryam. Then at National, to install that thinking, I became executive sponsor of Santa Fe Institute, which is another think tank in this area of, they call it complexity science, but it's the same idea. And it's like a never-ending thing. It's so deep, so it keeps me very intellectually engaged. I've been reading about it for at least 2007 until now, 13 years. And that has given me a very broad and good perspective on almost everything: economics, human nature, startups, business, investing, etc. That was, I think, the longest answer I ever gave, Arne.
Well, there we go. And you not only started or not only explain how you got interested into this, but you also started talking about the topic itself and how to think about that. So one of the things when you discuss that, one of the concepts there that I find hardest to understand is this analysis versus synthesis thinking. Because in my mind, those are not necessarily different, although they have different labels. It's more about the scope of what you analyze. So both, in my mind, are kind of analysis. It's just that synthesis has a much broader scope and includes more components in the analysis and how they interact, so to speak. But that's, in my mind, more a labeling issue that's confusing more than a clarification.
Let me give I think it depends on the context. So if you want to understand how, then you do analysis. If you want to understand why, then you do synthesis. So for example, let's take the MBA example. So MBA, I studied marketing, finance, etc. So you don't study interactivity of how marketing interacts with logistics, and how, if in logistics you do this, that has the implication of, on strategy, etc. So you don't study interactivity. On the other hand, in the systems thinking, you do study interactivity. So, for example, you see, okay, marketing is part of business. So, what role does marketing play in business? So that you study interactivity. So every system is part of some other system. So then you see, okay, what is the role this system plays in, the bigger system it's part of? Make sense?
Yeah, it does indeed make sense. It's just that to me, analysis can both answer how and why, and whatever is within your scope of your analysis can also include more complex things like interconnectedness or feedback, for example.
Mm-hmm. But in case of, let's look at the car example. You study, car is called a car. It used to be called horseless carriage because it comes from, horses. They basically replaced the horse with an engine. So that's why the engine is up front. So you wouldn't understand that from, analysis. So you'll have to go into the synthesis side to understand, okay, why is the engine there? So the history, it used part of transportation system, used to be this way. Yeah. And
Yeah.
some of the other buzzwords you would hear: self-organizing system, the concept of emergence, chaos, all that falls in this broad category of systems thinking or complexity science. Yeah.
Yep. Are there any other sort of key features that you think would be worthwhile bringing to our attention?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, when we chose the topic. So for a startup, so you have to see, let's say you're a startup in Norway. So you have to see, the system you're part of is the Nordic startup system, if you're creating a startup there. So yeah, and for any startup to scale or succeed, I think we discussed that in one of the previous podcasts. You need four things. You need an idea that becomes a product. You need a market for that idea. You need capital, and you need people. So two of those things. So it's the interactivity of these things. If you study that is, synthesis or applying systems thinking. But for that market, so if you are planning a startup in Norway, then you have to see, can you get the people in that market, because you have to operate within the system? Can you get the capital in that market? And is the market for your product in Norway, or is that outside of Norway? What do the VCs think? If you need capital, how do they make investment decision? They may be more, cash flow, profit oriented than scale oriented. So if your idea is to, create the new Facebook or Pinterest, where you have to basically spend money until you have billion users before you turn on advertising, then Norway may not be the best place to start or do it. So those are the things you think about and apply as a startup. And I think it's very relevant in terms of decision making. I think we did a podcast on that, on how you make decision when they're unknowns, because you start thinking as a system or in terms of system thinking that makes the decision making much more clear. Like the coronavirus example we were discussing, if some people were thinking of it as system, including Yamir Mariam, who I studied with, he's been warning since January to the US, because he understands interconnectivity. So you then can foresee things before others do. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in terms of you know, like we always talk about customer lifetime value. So if you, like, I think one example, another name I want to mention is Russell Eckhoff. So he was big in applying um, uh, system thinking to businesses. And in the notes, I'll post the blog post where I explain his uh, ideas. So basically, like, one example he gives is, if you have a headache, you don't do brain surgery. You take Advil, and because we understand how that part of the body goes into the bloodstream and it goes to the head and helps with the pain. But it happens in business all the time, more in bigger companies. We do, brain surgeries for headaches all the time. Why are the sales down here? Okay, we didn't do enough marketing. Let's do more marketing. So there isn't much like thinking, understanding of why is done in the business world. So one of the things for a startup you have to be crystal clear of is, why are people buying your product? If it has 10 features, what can you remove and people will still buy it? Generally that level of depth and testing is not done. um, but it depends on the company. A lot of times it's not possible, but sometimes even when it's possible, it's not done.
Yeah, so the system thinking is about how to look at how the whole fits together and how things impact whatever you're working on, and therefore making good decisions in whatever part of the overall system you operate in. And the example you give about, okay, so we're not getting enough customers, let's pour more money into marketing, for example. I think is in the corporate space, there's one element that is, the larger the organization, the more likely it is that you have silos. And that also means that wherever you can apply your force, being human resources or capital, is oftentimes within your silo. And the bigger it is and the bigger the organization, the less connected it tends to be with the other silos that it's meant to work together with. And you can't necessarily even see the interaction or interconnectivity, and you also can't apply your force across those boundaries. And this, in my mind, is one of the reasons why a startup has a good opportunity to compete, because a smaller organization with less silos have better interconnectivity within the organization between those parts. So if you manage to see the whole picture and think in the right way, you can also therefore operate more effectively across these interconnectivities or boundaries to make things happen in the right way.
Yep, absolutely. That's a very good point. I think that's the advantage startups have over big companies, because there's more interconnectivity, and that gives them the ability to move faster. Yesterday, I was talking to a friend, and he was asking me, "Oh, you work in tech? Like, can you explain to me why Zoom, which is like a startup, although they went public, but much small player in the tech space, why are they succeeding when Google has Google Meet, Hangout, Facebook has Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp video, Microsoft has Skype? So how is it that, like, this company went from 10 million daily active users to 200 daily active users in a month or less? And I go, well, there are multiple reasons. One, the user experience is better, etc. But I think the main reason is, by the time in these bigger companies, let's say Microsoft, whoever is running Skype, he or she got calendars aligned to get a meeting that takes a month. By the time they just get to the right interaction, this startup or the smaller company has already taken over the market. It's just getting calendar aligned in big company for the right people to interact. It's a long process because they have too many things, or the prioritization doesn't happen at the right time. So I think that's why if there are people who are worried about, oh, I shouldn't do this because Microsoft or Google or whoever can come and do this. So you don't have to worry about a big company coming and doing what you're doing. They just are too slow. If they could do that, none of the startups would exist. Most startups exist mainly because of the speed they can operate with.
Yeah. Of course, the startup itself has that advantage of the interconnectivity and sort of better ability to look at the overall picture internally. But of course, the startup is also part of the market. And the market is a messy place with, supply and demand and competition and all of these external factors as well that needs to be looked at as part of the overall system, the analogy being the car and the transportation system here. Mm-hmm. And that's a place necessarily where the startup does not have an advantage, because in that number of signals and interconnectivities out there, there's some things that have proved to be very important, and there are lots of things that have proved to be a lot of noise as well. And being able to filter and get an overview there is sometimes where a larger organization just has a better overview. But even a startup can read those signals, right? And if you read the important ones, you focus on the important ones for execution as well.
Yeah. And they can do this alignment and interactivity between the different groups or functions much faster, so they can respond faster. Yeah. So another thing I want to mention, which is an important concept, is the type of systems. We're talking about systems thinking. So I would say, and this comes from Yanir Baryam, there are three types of systems. One is where the system itself is not highly dependent on the parts. It's weakly dependent on the parts. So for example, a piece of paper, let's say it's a system of molecules organized in a certain way. You take a piece of paper away from that paper, then both the small piece of paper and large piece of paper retain the properties of paper. So both system and the parts are not dependent on each other for survival or whatever for their function. The second is where the system is weakly dependent on the part, but the part is highly dependent on the system. So for example, a tree, you take the branch off and the branch dies, but tree grows another branch. And third is a system where both the part and the system are interdependent on each other. So for example, a goat, you cut the goat head off and then both the head dies and the goat dies. So that's a way of thinking about what type of system you're operating in or you're looking at, and understanding the relationship between the parts and the system.
Yeah.
And this, you think everybody knows about prisoner's dilemma?
I wouldn't say everyone, but it's a fairly well-known example, or whatever we should call it.
Yeah, then we don't have to discuss it, because that's another concept used a lot in the complex systems or systems thinking world, because your response depends on interactivity based on two prisoners, or the results affect how people respond.
Yeah.
So what's the, in terms of investing, you look at, I think investors generally do more analysis than synthesis. So you look at every company and you analyze it, based on, the market size. Or why don't you tell us, like, how do you make your investment decision? Let's say you want to invest in a startup.
Well, let's say the normal way of approaching it is you kind of meet startups, you do like a quick view of, all right, are these like really special and talented people you think can build a great company? That's a very sort of subjective thing, but nevertheless, there are, ways of looking at, you're generally looking to invest in very ambitious and very clever people. Secondarily, you're looking at, is there a product here that solves a big pain point? I'm talking now typically in the B2B space, which is the space I'm operating most in, not in like some consumer thing that has a different agenda. But in the B2B space, is generally, is it solving a big problem? And therefore, is it worthwhile solving? And will people pay for it? That's kind of the pain point and the product side of it. And does it fit that need? So there's like a product type of view on it. Mm-hmm. And secondarily, is the potential big enough? Can it grow big enough, quickly enough to make it a venture investment? So people, product potential is sort of the thing you look at and triangulate quickly around to know whether you want to spend time on something. Secondarily, at the next level, you start analyzing dimensions of, well, I forgot one more thing is obviously you look if there's sort of traction and metrics that you can quickly say, well, is this already, in flight in a good direction. But beyond that, it's more, you start analyzing multiple dimensions of it. It could be market, it could be competition, it could be a number of go-to-market elements and so forth. And that's a multi-dimension analysis, but that falls in the analysis domain that you described before. And finally, there's a financial aspect of it where you look at the return profile, potential return profile of this, and whether valuations can make sense and capital need relative to where you're operating in your market, which is also a analysis game. I would say that some of dimensions around competition and market and so forth clearly deals with external factors that impact the potential investment case. And such, it's not a it's not a pure play silo-based analysis in single dimensions. There are elements of dealing with external factors that impact and so forth, but it's not necessarily thought of as systems thinking. Mm-hmm. More about external factors and interdependencies. Mm-hmm. And that could also relate to go-to-market if there are partners involved and channels and this sort of thing.
Yeah. So how much of all the investment decisions you make are for that specific startup as standalone startup? Like, can they succeed? I
not only can they succeed, are they likely to succeed big?
Yeah.
Or is there a risk reward that makes sense to make that investment?
But it's a standalone decision. You have a criteria, product, people, etc. But if you invest, you think that they will become, super big and super fast or something like that. Yeah.
Yes, that is correct. I would say that there are segments of the market that operate somewhat differently, in the sense that they might have a much more thesis-oriented approach where they say this particular market segment is going to be huge in the future. And I have belief in that, and I'm trying to figure out who are the likely candidates to take that market. And if it's not there, they might even be looking to fund somebody to build it, but most likely there are already a number of players going after that opportunity. And it's more about radar screen, finding the most likely winner and investing in the market leader. That does make sense, or is an approach of larger VCs that are playing sort of a global market or like US market or something like that, which is a much more top-down approach based on a very strong market segment thesis.
Mm-hmm. And do you look at, okay, this startup you want to invest in, it's going to become part of my portfolio where I have other startups, then those other startups are targeting these market segments or industries or whatever, then how does this fit in? Like you want to solve multiple startups or let me restate. Do you want the new startup you are investing in to solve a different problem than the other startups in the portfolio are solving? Or you want multiple startups solving the same problem in different ways?
Yes, I would claim that there's not a system-oriented approach to portfolio building. The portfolio building is more about avoiding conflicts of interest, and secondarily, spreading risk. So let's say if my portfolio today was all about digital tech for the travel industry, I would have a horrendous coronavirus portfolio, and you don't want that. So it's more about a diversification enough so you're not too exposed to specific risks that are joint amongst your portfolio.
Okay.
I can take a couple of examples where I think from the investment space where I think it's clear that system thinking has been failing and where that's caused problems. Okay. So the most obvious example, I would say, the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, which was essentially the financial system being brought down by packaged financial products that where you can discuss whether they were linear products or statistical products. But one example being like credit default swaps, which is essentially a collection of financial risk that's packaged, right? And judged based on a statistical basis that they won't all fail, and if they do, there's a portfolio approach to it that picks it up, and as a whole of the market is not significant enough to cause any problems. There's sort of the risk allocation on a statistical basis makes sense in isolation if you look at one package or two packages or something like that. However, when the risks of all the assets are correlated and they become a substantial part of the overall market in size, let's say the interdependencies and the assumptions around those don't hold anymore, and also the assumptions about statistical basis that was the fundament for doing the packaging don't hold. And when that unravels, you have a financial crisis. So I would say this is an example of where you didn't take a broad enough view of the systematic risk and manage the risk on a component basis rather than on a system basis, and that caused the failure.
Yeah, that's a very good example, Arne.
Yeah. The secondary approach is the first example is sort of a macro financial market issue. The other example is like from the old venture industry, and this is where if you look at the venture industry historically, what drives returns in the venture industry is big hits in funds, right? So to have a great fund, you should be an investor in one of the great outcomes. So if you're an investor in Apple at the time, you would have a great outcome. If you're an investor in Google at the time, you would have a great outcome, and Facebook and so forth, right? And if you look at historical returns on a on a statistical basis, those are the great funds, right? So that means A, you have to have a big hit in your portfolio, and secondarily, it sort of trickles down to if you have the biggest hits, then you win, right? But as funds go bigger, essentially, to have a meaningful outcome of a fund, you have to have one outcome that's like hundreds of millions of dollars, or preferably past $1 million mark to have a successful fund. That's just the statistical basis if you look at it historically. But if you look at that history, the reason why there were good funds was that they invested in the good companies, not the fact that they were highly valued. But when you start looking at those statistics, essentially your job becomes getting a unicorn into your portfolio, and you look at getting the answer by creating that answer. So you go and find a company, and if you just value it at $1 billion, you have a unicorn in your portfolio, and statistically, you should then have a successful, fund. But if you invest in two men and a dog, and you value them at $1 billion, it doesn't mean that you can realize $1 billion, right? That's the difference between correlation and causation, right? Yeah. So just valuing something at $1 billion doesn't make it a successful fund, and that's just this particular, like in the, let's say, 2014, 2015, there was this inflation in the unicorn segment, and there were clearly a lot of unicorns that hasn't come out to what they were expected, simply because this was sort of the logic that put price tag on them. So once again, maybe not as clear an example of a failure of systems thinking, but somewhat in the flavor of it anyway.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And at least to me, it is clear how the VC industry lacked in systems thinking. And we pointed that out in our analysis of companies last year. We analyzed many of the IPOs, and we raised these questions about the valuations, not about the macro investing side, but more on the individual companies. Yeah.
So I have a question for you, because like the listeners here are very fortunate in that they have two electrical engineers speaking here, and if you're an electrical engineer, you've had to take some classes where some system elements are definitely taught, right? Some cybernetics classes, or you've done Laplace transforms or something like that. So sort of the fundamentals of systems are maybe come more natural to some engineers than the public at large. But the system thinking approach is more about thinking of some of these contexts and putting them in a more broader context, but possibly slightly less mathematical than what they're done in an engineering context. And I've never really thought about myself as a systems thinker. At the same time, when I look at things, I tend to look at, well, what forces from the outside are impacting, and is there any feedback in the system, and this sort of thing. So there's sort of a little bit of a thinking around it, even if I don't systemize it. I don't have a method to the madness, so to speak. So I'm now here looking for the box or the tools to apply the system thinking. Do you have any tips, or is it free thinking, philosophy meets engineering? Let's see if there are any things going on there that impacts my thing.
It's interesting. I think as a VC, you try to put things in a box, and a lot of what you do is analysis. But
right.
When I talk to you, it seems like you do understand systems. So I think first thing I would say is have box-free thinking. Don't try to put anything in a box, because then you are confining your thinking to that domain, or you're not looking at it from a new perspective. But the tool would be, I think, as Akhoff explained, the first thing you ask is, what is this part of? Whatever you want to understand. Let's say you want to understand, I don't know, what's around here. A phone. Okay, what is the phone part of? The phone is part of, a telecommunication system which gives you the ability to communicate with others. It also an internet access device. And then you see, okay, what role does it play in the system it's part of? So, okay, we access the internet, we communicate, we buy things, we use apps, etc., etc. There are multiple ways of doing that, but this makes it, what makes this unique? It's the mobility. You have it with you all the time. It's personal, etc. And then you disaggregate that learning from how the bigger system works, or the parent system, and see what that tells you why this thing exists. So follow this 3-step. What is this part of? What role does it play in that bigger system it's part of? And then third, disaggregate that learning.
Okay. Can I still try to sell you a boxy system for it?
Yeah.
So I think I use boxes because they're helpful to me. And I think there are other people who are also helped by boxes, although they're maybe not always as square as they appear. But the way that I think about it is that, you start from where you are and there's probably a box. But one way to look at it is to figure out what other boxes are there out there, and what are the lines between my box and these boxes. And if there are forces of impacting, which way do the arrows go, and do they also come back with a feedback loop? So that's kind of how I think about these things. And I've seen there's one particular framework that a number of startups use that I see as a sort of systems thinking tool, even if it's not labeled as that, and that's the business model canvas. So the business model canvas has all these boxes with customer and value proposition and channels and costs and revenue streams and all of these things, which is essentially a way of breaking down your business model, which is a system, into different boxes, and try to figure out how each of the boxes work, but also figuring out how these interconnect with each other. And if you change one, how does that impact the rest of your business model? So I think that's a very boxy system that actually, or a boxy tool that actually implements system thinking. Of course, you can always zoom out and say the business model actually fits in the business and the business fits in the market and so forth. But at least I think it is an interesting tool in the business model space that actually has implemented system thinking without labeling it as such.
Good. I'm not familiar with it. If you found it useful, then people can look into it and see if they find it useful. That's good. So let me end on a short story or incident. I'm curious by nature. That's why I'm more into why than how. And so this is a few years ago, I was working at a big company, and it was late Friday evening, like 9 p.m. I had on something, or I don't know what, but I was working late. So my boss was there too, and he called me into his office, and he wanted to give me advice on, how I can get promoted, etc. He said, "Oh, you are good, etc., etc." So he praised me. Then he said, "But you ask a lot of why questions. Like, he has to explain to me why we want to do something, but when the CEO, his boss, asks him something to do, he just does it. He doesn't question him. So I should basically not ask why. And my response was why.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, but why is a super powerful question.
Yeah.
And it's surprising how often there's no answer for it. And oftentimes it's like, what, we've always done it this way or something. And that's when you know you're onto something.
Yeah. You're right. So anything else you want to add, Arne, to systems thinking? This is very, unusual box-free topic, but you found a way to put your boxes in.
Yeah, we can have a box with why in it.
Yeah.
Excellent. Now this is fun.
Okay. So thanks everybody for joining us. We'll see you next week. Stay safe. And thanks to all the workers who are still working and keeping or enabling this work at home lifestyle possible.
Absolutely. See you next time.
Okay. See you. Bye.